Insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. But if you're ready to level up your life and get results that truly matter in your health, business, mindset, and relationships, then this is the podcast for you. Welcome to Scheer Madness, where we have unscripted, real conversations with the world's top athletes, entrepreneurs, and coaches. Discover real-world and tactical advice from the best in the business. Let's go.
Hey everyone, today on the Scheer Madness podcast, we are going to be talking about all things muscle, protein, and functional medicine. We have Dr. Gabrielle Lyon on the show today, and she specializes in a concept called muscle-centric medicine. She received her doctorate in osteopathic medicine from Arizona College of Osteopathic Medicine and is board certified in family medicine. She earned her undergraduate degree in human nutrition from the University of Illinois, where she studied vitamin and mineral metabolism, chronic disease prevention and management, and the physiological effects of diet composition. She also completed a research and clinical fellowship in nutritional science in geriatrics at Washington University in St. Louis. In her private practice, she treats patients of all walks of life, from sarcopenic individuals that want to improve muscle to age independently to overweight and pre-diabetic adults who need to manage weight and improve lean body mass for better health, as well as working with elite military operators such as Navy SEALs. She had dozens of publications and has been featured in multiple media outlets. I initially heard Dr. Gabrielle Lyon on some of the podcasts that I listened to personally, and I was like, I need to get this girl on my podcast. And we had a ton of mutual friends. So I've already learned so much from her, just diving into everything that she talks about. And I know you guys are going to take away so much here today. So welcome to the show here.
Yeah, I'm glad that we were able to make this work.
Yes. So I think muscle-centric medicine is a concept that's incredibly important, but it's not something that most people are very familiar with. Right. And talking about muscle and how important that is for prevention, longevity, and overall health span, why is this something that piqued your interest initially on?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Well, number one, I have to say that the concept that muscle is this organ of longevity and really the primary generator of health and wellness is very overlooked. Why is that? I think as a society, people are very problem focused. So the concept of having root cause medicine, is not the norm. So we often think of, problems that we can see. But the issue with that is that when you focus on a problem, you oftentimes get more of the problem as opposed to this idea of being more solution oriented. On a more granular level, everybody has been focused on adipose tissue, fat tissue. It's this constant lose weight, yo-yo dieting. People need to decrease their body fat. And that actually is the wrong focus. And we have a failure of the fat-focused paradigm, which is what we're seeing. You and I see this all the time. There's a recidivism rate. There's a relapse rate of people trying to lose those same 5 to 10 pounds that they've always tried. Mm-hmm. It is very easy to focus on fat tissue, but it's incorrect. So the true way to move the needle is by focusing on skeletal muscle. And skeletal muscle, by shifting the perception and the focus of fat focus to muscle-centric, you can really make substantial changes. And I think one of the reasons that people don't focus on it so much is, number one, it's hard to measure, right? Everyone is so different in terms of their ability to gain muscle, to train, right? It requires a lot of effort. And it just really is it's a changing the paradigm of thinking.
Yeah. And I actually saw in one of your posts, you talking about being fat phobic versus being muscle centric. And I really love just the the difference between the two. And one's just kind of focused on fear, on, losing as much fat as possible, which inevitably you usually lose muscle tissue as well.
Right.
When we're just solely focused on fat loss versus when we're focused on building muscle, we're going to actually equip our body to function optimally to burn fat more easily in the long run. And that's what a lot of what we try to do with our clients with my practice. But I think it's kind of hard at first to get people to understand that. I think also because we view muscle as just movement. And I think even when it comes to women, right? I don't want to build a lot of muscle. I want to be small as possible. And we look at muscle as just pure movement and even sometimes aesthetic, but it's a lot more than that. And I think with your research, you talk about as how muscle tissue goes beyond movement and just aesthetics, but also how it helps with blood sugar, how it helps with all these other different things as well too. So what are some things that muscle actually helps with beyond just, movement and strength?
So I'm going to tell you a little story. And I'm going to tell you a little bit of story about the birth of muscle-centric medicine. I did a clinical research fellowship at Washington University, and I did it in geriatrics, which was part of the deal, which is 65 and up. And I also did it in obesity medicine. So I did clinical research in obesity. So part of the research project that I was working on was imaging people's brains. And it was overweight women looking at their brains, looking at the brain matter and correlating that to waistline. And I'll never forget this one patient. And, I spent a lot of time with these guys, did a lot of cognitive testing. There was a lot of exercise involved. There was a lot of high value research being done, right? A lot of data collection. So this one woman, she was a mother of 3 children and really, really amazing human being. She'd always put herself last. And she had spent her life being overweight. And when I went to image her brain, I saw in her 40s flattening of her brain matter. So the symptomology hasn't presented itself, but I knew that she was going to have later life dementia. And it was so striking for anyone who's had an older parent or anyone that's seen anyone with dementia. There was a moment in time looking at this 40-year-old woman going, oh my God, this is largely from this ebb and flow of body composition, of never having enough muscle, constantly being overweight, having poor glycemic control. And, the effects of her brain were outrageous. It was outrageous because there is a correlation between the wider the waistline, the lower the brain volume. And that is very profound. When you see something like that in, decades before it's going to manifest, becomes very profound. And that really is where muscle-centric medicine was born, which is this concept that muscle is the largest organ of is the organ of longevity. And why? Exactly what you pointed out. Really, there's 2 ways to dispose of glucose. The liver, which is very small, the amount of, glucose that you're going to move into the liver, you don't really want that to be your primary site, or skeletal muscle. And you pointed out that muscle is so much more than locomotion, which is totally true, right? We all want to look good in a bikini. That's incredible. But muscle is the largest organ by mass in the body. And it is really responsible for body composition. While body composition on the surface is about looking good, the metabolic effects are paramount. And that means glucose disposal. When we think about obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and with this woman, Alzheimer's disease, you have to focus on skeletal muscle, which is responsible for a large part of glucose disposal, right? And not just muscle at rest, which is okay, but exercising muscle, right? So this is where you are going to dispose of any kind of excess glucose, and not even excess glucose. It is a primary site for glucose disposal as is. So when you think about things that can be toxic for an individual, that is excess glucose, right? Glucose in and of itself is toxic. It's the definition of diabetes. So glucose disposal, number one. cholesterol, fatty acid metabolism also takes place in the muscle, fatty acid metabolism in particular. So the more muscle mass you have, the more fatty acids you're going to utilize. It's also very important for when we think about an amino acid reservoir. So right now, if individuals become injured, if they get sick, if they're on bed rest, your survivability increases with the amount of skeletal muscle mass that you have. So these are all very, very valuable aspects of the trajectory of aging and the trajectory of health.
Yeah. So it goes so far beyond just aesthetics and
Totally.
Movement. And I think a lot of people don't think about brain health. And I actually taught a course recently on nutrition for brain health. And one of the biggest things we talked about was being protein deficient. And a lot of people don't realize that even your neurotransmitters, serotonin, dopamine, are made from these amino acids, tyrosine, tryptophan. So if you're protein deficient, it's going to also affect your cognitive function. And as you mentioned, your waist to hip ratio and how that correlates to your brain size, volume as well too. And I saw something recently, they're actually calling Alzheimer's type 3 diabetes.
Yeah. And it's actually been called that for a really long time. And people are, they find that so unusual, but, type 3 diabetes of the brain, we know there's insulin receptors in the brain.
Yeah.
And that has to do with the flattening of the brain matter depending on body composition. And listen, there's a huge genetic component of Alzheimer's, but you cannot discount the metabolic component, which is incredibly important.
Yeah, well, like genetics load the gun, right? But it's our lifestyle and diet that pulls the trigger at the end of the day. So it's just knowing these things, if we have the genetics, and then paying that much more close attention to our diet and lifestyle and all these different factors. So when you encounter a patient who's at this point, though, where they are so under-muscled and they're diabetic and they have a lot of excess fat, which I see a lot with my practice too. I get a 50, 60-year-old who comes in, I do an in-body body composition analysis, and they are, sometimes 15 pounds of skeletal muscle mass low based off of this is just normal standards too, of just like the general population. And then they're, 20, 30 pounds of fat over of what their ideal body mass should be. And I find it really, really difficult at this point to honestly even achieve fat loss, because usually they're coming in for fat loss. I want to lose fat. And they had no idea that they were so low in muscle tissue. And it's hard at that point to really make the switch, because also their hormones are usually low, maybe menopausal, and they're at the point where it's just really difficult to make that switch. So what are some things you would do for a client who comes in or a patient who's at this point and trying to lose fat and they're so under-muscled already? Yeah.
So I really focus on, and there's a new paper that came out, I'll have to find it and I'll send it to you. It talks about how it's much more detrimental to lose skeletal muscle than it is to gain fat, which is really interesting. So the concept of losing skeletal muscle, this organ, is much greater, it has a much greater impact than actually gaining body fat. The first thing you have to do is really work on increasing skeletal muscle. And that is, when you think about the multiple domains, hormone balancing is important. And, it's true that there's no direct correlation between the amount of testosterone, a perimenopausal woman is going to be on and the increase in skeletal muscle. So the data isn't there, but I will tell you around perimenopause, that is when women lose the most skeletal muscle. So when their periods become irregular, when they go through menopause, that is the most drastic loss in skeletal muscle during that time. So what do? Well, number one, if they are a candidate, you do want to address their hormones. So whether, estrogen plays a role in skeletal muscle, which is, it's still on the newer science, but it does play a role. Same with testosterone. So making sure that those hormones are balanced is important. And then, of course, moving them to resistance exercise, depending on the training status of an individual. So if an individual is more untrained, they will have a more rapid response to resistance training, right? So there's a training component, whether they are a novice trainer or whatever, novice in training. And then, of course, dietary protein, which is the most misunderstood and emotional aspect of all of nutrition, is protein. And, maybe because protein has a face, it becomes very emotional for people. But that is also another aspect of really optimizing body composition. If you optimize skeletal muscle, everything else falls into place. So hormone balancing, and of course, increasing resistance training, and then optimizing for protein.
Yeah. And let's talk about animal protein, because that is a very controversial subject, and especially with a lot of the documentaries coming out as well too. And I get a ton of vegans, vegetarians who come into my practice, excuse me, who come into my practice, and, one of the first things they say is, can you help me stay on a vegan diet? I went on it and I feel better, and that's usually the first thing that they tell me, and that they want to steer away from animal meat because of, all these different misinformation that they've been hearing. So for someone who's coming in, has a vegetarian or a vegan-based diet, what are some of the top things you like to educate them on? And especially if they are saying that they feel better, switching to more of a plant-based diet too.
Yeah. So I would, I think that that's a really interesting question, because you have to qualify, what does feeling better mean? Is it an emotional improvement that they're feeling better, or are they in the honeymoon phase of a more of an elimination diet, which can last a few months? So really understanding the perspective of, obviously, the client, of where they're coming from. Then when it comes to education, I think that the vegan and vegetarian, so the quality of protein, if you switch to a plant-based protein, has 3 times more calories, right? So we know that when we talk about protein quality, it relates to the amino acid profile. And it is very well documented, the difference in amino acid profiles between an animal-based protein source and a plant-based protein source. And I would say that one of the myths is that they have the same amino acids. They may, in large part, have the same amino acids, but the amount of amino acids are different. And it's that nuance of understanding that it is those essential amino acids, meaning it's those amino acids that must be eaten in the diet, that are really important and valuable. So for example, if an individual wants to go more plant-based and they want to get the same amount of protein in 3 ounces of beef or chicken, they might need to eat 6 cups of quinoa, which is 1,500, or 1,200 calories, or whatever it is.
Yeah.
And it's it's the carbohydrate load that can be devastating, especially if you care about longevity, Alzheimer's, obesity, cardiovascular disease. Calorie excess in the form of carbohydrates is a negative. So I think getting really smart and strategic if you're vegan and vegetarian, and that means perhaps cutting back on the higher carbohydrate load and augmenting with shakes, which is kind of unnatural, when you're just drinking shakes, the pea or rice blend, which can be valuable if that's the route you go, or augmenting with some branched chain amino acids.
Yeah. So in terms of amino acid, what are the big differences between that plant protein and that animal protein? Because I've heard you talk a lot about the amino acid profile and how important that is as well.
So the ones that I think are really valuable to focus on are the branched chain amino acids. And in particular, so the branched chain amino acids are leucine, isoleucine, and valine. Those must be ingested from the body. They cannot be made. And what makes them so important is they play a very unique role in the body. And in particular, leucine, which is one of the branched chain amino acids, plays a very unique role in something called mTOR stimulus. So a mechanistic target of rapamycin is what is the complex that is needed to be stimulated for muscle protein synthesis. And it does a lot of other things in the body, but as it relates to skeletal muscle, leucine is a very potent stimulator of mTOR. And you guys are like, well, why do we care about mTOR? We care about mTOR because you care about skeletal muscle. And when you are sub-threshold of this amino acid, the body doesn't even attempt to generate that process of muscle turnover, muscle laydown. It's a very ATP expensive process, meaning it takes a lot of energy for that kind of a thing to happen, to lay down skeletal muscle, which arguably makes a lot of sense. So by understanding that that's where the 6 cups of quinoa come in. So really, it's really based on that leucine requirement. Sadly, the leucine requirement is about, according to the RDA, which we know is the baseline for really just staying alive, right? It's just going to prevent deficiencies, is about 2 to 3 grams of leucine. That is what I recommend per meal. So for me personally, the RDA is sadly below what is required for any kind of optimization. And that is just enough to keep you kind of status quo, and arguably you'll continue to lose muscle as you age. And when I say age, I mean above 30, right? So you are going, is this process, this continuum of aging. So 2 to 3 grams of leucine is the RDA, but what I recommend is 2 to 3 grams per meal. And the reason is because it's a safety zone of stimulating leucine. So we know that you need between 1.8 to 2.5, maybe a little bit more depending on your age, to stimulate muscle protein synthesis. And that is roughly in 30 grams of protein.
So plant-based foods, so quinoa, soy, all that, don't have a good amount of leucine in it.
No.
So a good option for muscle.
You would need, you could get it, but your caloric load would be triple.
Yeah.
And so especially for your clients, if you're looking for body composition changes, you're not wanting to get your protein from plant sources. It's just not ideal. Can it be done? Absolutely. But it's not ideal. And then the other aspect is, when you're young, you can offset the, muscle. The 2 major ways to stimulate muscle are resistance training and dietary protein and just ATP in general, like calories in general. When you are young, you can get away with less dietary protein because your hormonal status is higher, right? You have more hormones, you're more, oftentimes more active, right? So all of that's really important.
Mm-hmm. I think we run into those outliers like the social media influencers as well too, who are the vegan bodybuilders. And we see the general public, well, this guy was able to build a substantial amount of muscle following a vegan-based diet.
Right.
And it was that main thing you said. One, you have to be working out like crazy typically because the exercise stimulates muscle growth. And then hormones are playing a big role as well too. So that may be an outlier, but again, like you said, it's not very ideal. And I think that's interesting to talking about protein needs increasing as we get older, because on the opposite end too, oftentimes we see the older population eating less protein.
Always.
Or just eating less in general is what I see a lot. It's just the whole eat less, to lose weight, because we're afraid we're going to gain fat. And it just becomes more of that fat phobic versus being muscle-centric type mindset. Totally. So what is the protein recommendation for someone who is, let's say, going through menopause or someone who is in their 20s?
Yeah. So let me just tell you what I recommend. Overall, a safety zone, which I've been doing this 15 years, I recommend 1 gram per pound ideal body weight. Mm-hmm. I don't really care an individual's age at that point, because now it encompasses a 20-year-old. And listen, hey, that's probably, that is way more than enough for a 20-year-old. But, it's a great place to start. And I'm going to tell you why. Because there is this satiation effect with the brain with protein. So a lot of the younger women that I take care of oftentimes have some kind of emotional tie to food, whether it's binge eating or obsessive thinking or body dysmorphia, whatever it is. When you optimize for protein, and this is data out of Heather Leidy's lab, when you optimize for protein, it changes the brain's desire to overeat, to binge eat. And I think that that's very valuable. And does it affect body composition? Do you need that amount of protein when you're 20? You don't. However, it can protect you or protect an individual from a ton of suffering because of the neurotransmitter effect and the brain effect and the blood glucose effect. So I like that for that age. For older individuals, and there's a great paper called the PROAGE. So it's a PROAGE recommendation, and it came out a while ago now. And it really talks about the details and the change in recommendations. And they recommend, roughly 1.6 grams per kilogram. I think that we're going to find that that's too little. And that's why I recommend 1 gram per pound ideal body weight for an aging individual. Here's the difference. The difference is it's in a dosing meal amount. When there is an older individual, and we're talking about, say, perimenopause, and that's not necessarily older, but you have all those other influences like changing hormonal status. When an individual has a robust protein amount, particularly at that first meal, I don't really care when that is, between 40 to 45 grams of protein, you are now coming out of a fasting catabolic state. And by keeping the carbohydrates low at that first meal and having a robust protein amount, you optimize that mTOR pathway and you can stimulate muscle protein synthesis. That is really important for that first meal because then that sets up your metabolism throughout the next 24 hours. And that is really an ideal strategy for everybody. And initially, I always teach people to do an even distribution of protein, but, I'm finding the more, I experiment with the data, that can be changed and that can evolve.
So you're recommending about 45 grams of protein per meal?
For the first meal. So this is really important. So normally I always talk about an even distribution, a minimum of 30 grams 3 times a day.
Okay.
Older individuals don't go for that. Okay. So as their changing hormonal milieu happens, they have lower stomach acid, they just feel full. So an older individual and a perimenopausal individual, if you hit 40 grams per that first meal, that's ideal. You can decrease that second meal and then have another robust amount towards the end, which is part of what I've been recommending now for the perimenopause women. And it's been working fantastic.
So would this be based off of doing like 2 to 3 meals per day then?
It would be. It would be. And it's really based on that mTOR. It's that it's the stimulation of mTOR. The body has to recuperate and then you stimulate it again. But we don't actually know how long that mechanistic target of rapamycin stays stimulated. So it doesn't have to be an even distribution. Listen, there's benefits for an even distribution as it relates to blood sugar regulation, emotional eating. There's all these other benefits. But when we're talking about changing the strategy for an aging individual, really starting that first meal with a robust amount and then ending the day with a more robust amount is really what I've seen to work the best for anyone who's perimenopause or older, because now you're getting in 2 meals of stimulating mTOR, right? Of really optimizing for muscle protein synthesis to the best of an individual's capacity based on nutrition. And it seems to fit in with a lower caloric intake.
Yeah. So if we're doing you said 1 gram per pound of ideal body weight,
yeah.
And then distributing that between about 2, 3-ish meals with 45 grams first thing in the morning, breakfast, the bigger bulk again in the evening time. For a lot of my clients, the biggest question I get in my audience is this doesn't feel it feels a little bit restrictive, right? That's probably the biggest question that we get. And, just prioritizing protein, I think because it's satiating, we cut out a lot of the other stuff as well too. One thing I talk to my clients about is if we can focus on what we need to eat more of, we're going to inevitably eat a lot less of all these other foods, the processed foods, the carbohydrates, and then if we're eating more fats to go along with that, fats and protein together, and you add maybe sometimes a little bit of fiber in, it's very satiating. And more often than not, we can't even eat a lot of those because it's very filling to eat that much food from, very nutrient dense sources. So we do 1 gram per pound of lean body mass, but you're suggesting even maybe going a little bit higher with that protein intake?
Yeah, because I think a lot of people, from a practicality standpoint, unless they're actually measuring their lean body mass, and with the current situation, it's not, it's hard to do. And also, what if an individual only has 15 pounds of lean body mass?
Yeah, sure.
So then you're dosing something off of a body mass that is suboptimal, and then you also have to think, based on the science, you do need a certain leucine threshold to stimulate mTOR. So the way in which an individual would do that would be a minimum of 30 grams of protein. So you could scale it back by doing 30 grams of protein, then you are stimulating mTOR. But if a person only has, 45 pounds of lean muscle mass, you're going to be sub-threshold, because when you think about just the regenerative process and also the needs of an individual, I think that that's where increasing it becomes very relevant.
Do you think it's beneficial to cycle protein? Because I think that's something I've heard you talk about, and a lot of people talking about intermittent fasting, muscle and autophagy, and how that can be beneficial. And especially for someone who's maybe having some metabolic issues with weight loss and, getting on a higher protein diet. And I'm actually currently working with a client who, one of the biggest problems we're running into is she can't do a whole lot of exercise. She has a lot of nerve damage, and she needs to lose about 30 pounds of fat to go into a surgery for her to get. And it's been really, really difficult because she's just kind of stuck on this mindset. I don't want to eat a whole lot because, I'm going to put on fat. So we started doing a couple things is, upping that protein. She was doing 2 meals per day and getting probably, I think maybe 20 grams of protein. So 40 grams of protein in a day, and someone in their 50s already, probably low in skeletal muscle mass, and then over fat. And then you add in the exercise component to go along with it. And it's very, very difficult. So for someone like that, some things we started to do was, 1, prioritize getting in more protein, at least 3 meals per day, and at least 30 grams of protein with each meal, very similar to what you mentioned. We added in a lot of healthy fats to go along with that. So avocados, some other things like olive oils, just to help get in some other types of fats. And then a little bit of fiber, so leafy greens, cruciferous vegetables. Right. And she found that to be good, very satiating. But then the biggest problem we're running into is still just her blood sugar levels are a bit high. And she is diabetic. She has some insulin resistance going on. And the way I view it, sometimes when we have insulin resistance and high blood sugar, is it's kind of like the gas tank to your car is full, right? And you need to drive the car for a bit to empty that gas tank. And you can't just keep trying to fill it up with gas every single day, especially if you're not moving, because you're not running that car very much as well too. So for someone who's in that boat, do you think like fasting and doing some, 24-hour, 36-hour fasts or intermittent fasting would be better?
So a modified protein sparing fast would be good for her. So if she's diabetic, and it sounds like she's a somewhat of a brittle diabetic, there's issues with blood sugar, and that can be very dangerous for that individual. So what I would recommend for someone like this would be a modified protein sparing fast, which would be very low carbohydrate, lower in fat. You prioritize protein to protect skeletal muscle, and you compress her feeding window. But I would also stick a continuous glucose monitor on her and see how she's actually doing. And she has to be moving, even if it's just walking. You do need that for glucose disposal. That's what I would do with someone like that.
Okay. So what are some of the benefits though to cycling protein?
So I love that you brought this up. And actually, I have a program coming soon about protein cycling, but it's different than what people think. So it's not actually cycling over the weeks, it's cycling throughout the day. Okay. So it's understanding there's a cyclical nature to protein ingestion that can be utilized to optimize body composition. And that is very, very, very important. And that goes back to understanding whether it's 30 grams per meal an even distribution, or if it's front loaded and back loaded with a smaller meal in between or no meal in between. So it's actually cycling protein amounts throughout the day versus cycling them throughout weeks. So I do think that, when we talk about autophagy, I don't think risking skeletal muscle is worth it. I think that the older you get, the more it becomes difficult to maintain. And what happens is there's anabolic resistance and changes to the skeletal muscle that happen. There's fat infiltration into the actual tissue that becomes an issue, So I think that when an individual does do, and can they tolerate fasting? Yes, but I think exactly what you're saying, an alternative way would be to increase activity. And I think that becomes more beneficial for that aging population, as opposed to fasting for an aging population, because they're already moving towards that sarcopenic phenomenon.
Okay. So cycling protein during the day, you're saying more at the beginning, skipping a meal, doing more later in the day, and just doing that consistently on a daily basis then?
Yeah. Okay. And individuals can sign up on my website. I have a program coming out about this, it's kind of a newer concept, and it's really related to the mechanisms of the body and how that could be beneficial and some of the science behind that. It is a strategy that can be utilized, as opposed to this concept of protein cycling through weeks or months, where, for example, there is like a fasting mimicking diet, which is a methionine restriction. Do I think that there's some benefit to that? Possibly. And I do have some patients that do that, like 3 weeks on and then a week where they do a fasting mimicking diet, which can be beneficial. But you really just have to think, what is the age of that individual and what is the ultimate goal that we're really, how are we going to get to this end result?
So one thing I've heard you talk about too is like, we've had carbohydrates wrong. We've had
totally
wrong about fats. We've now, probably more than likely we had it wrong about protein. Yeah. What are your current thoughts about utilizing carbohydrates in the diet? Of course, when we're working with someone who's diabetic or overweight, we want to minimize that as much as possible. But let's say for a general population or an athlete, how would you utilize carbohydrates? And I know with our clients, we put a lot of carbohydrates at the end of the day. So we do a little bit of backloading and doing mainly in the beginning of the day that protein, fats, and fiber for each meal, because we seem more full and satisfied, and we don't get a lot of the hangry sensations that we're getting with the blood sugar fluctuations. So we utilize that. And then of course, athletes have a little bit of a increased requirement for carbohydrates. So they're not just burning, tapping into muscle tissue, but they have just a more readily source of fuel as well. So how would that differentiate with carbohydrates, and how do you utilize that with the people you?
So I think that people need to understand that carbohydrates, the traditional way of thinking about carbohydrates is your carbohydrate for a 24-hour period. So what does that look like? Say this person has 100 grams of carbohydrates for the day or 130 grams of carbohydrates. And that's an incorrect way of looking at it when it comes to optimizing for body composition and optimizing for health. Carbohydrates need to be thought of as a meal tolerance. And really, because, no matter how you look at it, excess insulin is a problem. Okay. So by keeping your carbohydrate meal threshold on the lower end, and depending on the person, it could be 25 grams up to 40 grams, but I never recommend going above 40 grams because you get a more robust insulin response. So when we think about a meal threshold of carbohydrate, it becomes incredibly valuable when you look long-term and you look at other metabolic markers, right? You cannot discount ebbs and flows of insulin. So I tend to be very conservative with carbohydrates. I think that you have to earn your carbohydrates. The RDA recommends 130 grams. And listen, my mentor, Dr. Donald Lehman, would say, you should start there, and you can argue standard deviation above and below that amount. From clinical practice, I think people do much better on a lower level of carbohydrate. And again, it also depends, right? So if an individual is starting at 100 grams, I think that's a great starting point. And I never put carbohydrates at the first meal. So I do backload it. And then it's, again, that meal distribution is really key and I think very misunderstood.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think be aligned with where the carbohydrates should fall. And I think a lot of people find that interesting too, because the old advice was carbohydrates first thing in the morning, boost your metabolism. You're going to have more energy throughout the day. And if anything, it does the exact opposite. You're going to feel tired, fatigued. You're going to get a crash, if not like an hour after you eat your breakfast. And it's just not very effective. And then you're going to be burning carbohydrates throughout the day as your primary source of fuel versus burning fats. And if we lose fat, if that is our ultimate goal, we're going to want to burn fats for our primary source of fuel and be better able to utilize that. And I don't think people realize the importance of blood sugar balance as well too, when it comes to mood, when it comes to fat loss. And that's probably the first thing that we try to do with all of our clients is we need to balance our blood sugar with the ratio, protein, fats, getting in a little bit of fiber with each meal, and then the meal timing as well too. Do you recommend the small, I kind of already know your answer, but I think the old advice was also small meals throughout the day. Yeah. What do you find that's problematic with that approach?
So, I think that I think there's a couple reasons. I think that, and I won't go into this in detail. People can read about it on my IG, but there's that mTOR stimulus. You don't want to stimulate that throughout the day, right? And a much more potent stimulus of mTOR. So the positive aspect is skeletal muscle, but there's mTOR complexes in all tissues, right? Pancreas, liver, brain, heart. You don't want a chronic stimulation of that. So you don't want to be feeding throughout the day. That can be very negative. And also you're teaching your body that you're always having to eat. And just from a logical standpoint, that doesn't make sense. The other thing is then your sub-threshold protein meals throughout the day, right? And we know that the older you get, the more important it is to kind of batch those meals together. So those are two reasons. And then the other thing is, again, compliance is key. Mm-hmm. So being able to do something long-term, and if an individual already has issues with cravings or issues with food intake, then having them continuously feed is a real problem.
I agree with all of that. Yeah. And I think that's one of the biggest things is every time you sit down to eat, food's in front of you, are more than likely going to want to continue eating because it's enjoyable to eat. So especially with someone who has food addiction, that can be really problematic as well too. So something that I was thinking about is bodybuilders. So I know that's not like my general population or clients that I work with, but coming from the fitness industry, being a fitness model, bikini competitor as well too, that lifestyle is very different than, the general public nutrition. But a lot of what they're doing is, the small frequent meals, increasing that mTOR muscle synthesis, trying to do that throughout the day. But is there a threshold where having too much protein can be problematic, or even muscle tissue in and of itself well too, especially with a lot of bodybuilders, taking pro-hormones to stimulate increased muscle protein synthesis?
I think that's a very interesting question and an answer that nobody knows. So can you eat too much protein? I've never seen that. Hypothetically speaking, is there issues with urea and ammonia? Maybe, but I've never seen that. And some of the studies are up to 3.3 grams per kilogram. I've actually never seen that. I think I've heard about one case, but the individual had a genetic defect in their ability to enzymatically process whatever it was. I can't totally remember, but I've actually never seen it. And I've never seen data that supports that. So we just don't know. I think you also bring up another good point. With anabolics, is there ever an issue with too much muscle? And I can't say that I know that answer, but when we think about anabolics, oftentimes it's not just as it relates to skeletal muscle. So anabolic is overall growth in general. So, perhaps the growth of organs are not necessarily in an individual's, best interest. So then there's components of that.
Okay. And I think that's interesting because, I've ran blood work on bodybuilders, and sometimes their blood work though looks identical to someone who's diabetic who's really overweight as well too.
Yeah. Absolutely. And some of that's from growth hormone. There's an increase in, possibly depending on what it is, in insulin resistance. So there's that. It is diet. Yes, it can increase what looks like diabetes for sure with insulin resistance. And then depending on the anabolic that's used, it can decrease cholesterol, like decrease HDL, it can increase LDL. And, depending on an individual's predisposition, that can definitely be not advantageous.
And then in the long run, when you come off of it, your body isn't able to carry that much muscle tissue naturally. So you lose it. And then we have a lot of these other problems as well too, with having low hormones because our body has now been dependent on an outside source for hormones.
Yeah. And I'm going to throw something else that I've seen that I think is under-recognized is that and this is what I've seen from treating, my husband's a SEAL, treating a lot of the military operators, is sleep apnea. So what happens is the neck musculature becomes very big and heavy. And a lot of the guys that I see, I order sleep studies on, because what happens is as they put on more muscle mass, they unknowingly get sleep apnea. And that changes cortisol, glucose regulation, and increases insulin resistance. So you compile that with any kind of growth hormone analog. Now you're running into trouble.
Yeah,
and that's actually preventable, right? So the sleep apnea is not per se preventable, yes, but also treatable. And that becomes very important.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So what are some of the things like you used to believe about nutrition that you no longer believe? Because I know for me, going to Baylor for nutrition and dietetics, most of the things that I talk about with my nutrition practice and for my clients, it was the complete opposite of what I learned in school. So what were some of the things that you used to believe and then slowly over time that you realized was very, very bad education that you got?
Yeah, I actually am very fortunate because I trained under Dr. Donald Lehman. So I did University of Louisville, I did University of Louisville as well, but I did University of Illinois, vitamin mineral metabolism, and I trained under Dr. Donald Lehman. And he's actually a world-leading expert in protein nutrition. So the education that I received is outstanding. So I would say that there was nothing that I was taught, because he's a very honorable scientist. He's not someone who reads the book and then translates the book. He's someone that does the research. So the foundation of the education was really great. So there was nothing that all of a sudden that I learned that I was surprised about. And same with my fellowship. So I was in someone named Sam Klein's lab at WashU, which was also exceptional, one of the top labs in the country. What I think is the most interesting that I learned wasn't necessarily directly related to nutrition. It was more related to medicine. So I studied traditional medicine, and obviously I practice functional medicine. So there's a huge dichotomy between what is, really healing and what is kind of taught in Western medicine. And I think that was one of the biggest things that I saw a huge dichotomy in. But that being said, I wouldn't change the fact that I did, 17 years of higher education for that, right? Because it allows me a framework for thinking about something. And I think that that's essential. So just like you went and you got the correct framework of learning how to think, even if you challenged those beliefs or you challenged what you were being taught, you still did the appropriate training. And I think that that's very valuable. So, long story short, I would say that the technicality of the implementation of medicine is much different than how I practice and what I look at. Yeah. So those two things are very different.
And I think it's incredibly important, the difference between Western medicine and functional medicine. And a lot of us don't understand really the difference where, with Western medicine, I get clients who are surprised that they're offered medicine. They're offered an antidepressant, they're offered a lot of these different things, where with functional medicine, we're focused more on the root cause of the issue.
Right.
Diet, we're focused on the lifestyle, we're focused on the mind as well too, to optimize health. And I think functional medicine is becoming a little bit better, well known, but there's still, conflict between the two at the end of the day. And that's how I got into functional medicine, was through my own health issues and going through and basically being a test subject to all these different doctors. It felt like, with being thrown on birth control, antidepressants, right, Accutane, even at one point, and then, finally realizing that all of these things were just Band-Aids to an underlying cause at the end of the day. Then learning about functional medicine, learning a lot about gut health that we talk about with my practice as well too. And that the power that nutrition and diet really does play a role in how much that's going to impact everything else. And we've touched on a couple of those different things, between your brain health, your metabolic health, with your body composition, with how you age. And, I think what we're really looking at the end of the day is our health span, not just lifespan. And right. So
it's all about health span.
Yeah.
It's not about lifespan. It is.
And I think
I've seen lifespan. I worked in a nursing home. That's not how that's not where you want to be.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I think functional medicine, we're doing just that. We're focused on health span, where, with Western medicine, if you're in a nursing bed home and you're not able to fully live your life and enjoy it, it's like, what's the point? And a lot of this comes down to taking more of a preventative approach with our diet, and just making that a priority in our life. So where are some good resources that people can refer to when it comes to a high protein based diet, animal protein? Because I think that's going to be the number one thing that we hear from a lot of people, is where are the sources? Because there's so much bad information out there about following a vegan diet, about how that's going to be better for your health. And I get clients even coming to me who their doctors are recommending, you need to go on.
That's a shame. That's a shame. Mm-hmm. So I think the number one thing is you have to know where to look. So on my Instagram, I always put studies, right? So some of the big researchers are Dr. Donald Layman, or Stu Phillips, or Luke Van Loon. And I always include, like I said, studies on my Instagram page, also my newsletter. I always put high value articles in there that I vetted. And I think knowing who you trust and understanding where they were educated, and if they were educated and they are subject matter experts, I think that's very valuable. Just because an individual is a physician doesn't mean they're trained in nutritional sciences. So I think really understanding where the information is coming from. People should not get their information from entertainment sources like documentaries, right? They're not peer-reviewed type literature, right? So that I think that's really important to understand.
Yeah. What are two things that you would want people to take away from today that you think that they could start implementing with their diet today that would be easy?
So high quality animal-based protein, absolutely essential. And, according to the NHANES data, which is the largest data set, we are under eating protein. Okay. So optimizing for protein, number one, and then, really mitigating excess carbohydrate consumption, and, following along the lines of making sure caloric balance matters, because it does matter. There's a lot of information out there that says, well, calories don't matter. They do. I mean, while calorie efficiency is different, you can see that from the twin studies, from the Bouchard twin studies, but it still matters. So number one, optimize for protein. And number two, really minimize excess carbohydrates, and understanding that carbohydrates are in a meal threshold amount. And then number three, which you didn't ask for, number three would really be looking at caloric load.
Yes. I know we're running out of time, but do you have your clients typically track their caloric intake?
You do? I do.
Yeah.
Because you can't change what you don't have data for. So I do that. And, I have a lot of good information on my YouTube if people really want to get more into the science. I do conversations with my mentor, he is an academic, which is one of the reasons I do it, because otherwise he doesn't have the opportunity to teach the public. And him and I talk science all the time. So we really wanted to bring it to you guys, which I think is very valuable.
Yeah, I'll have to check that out. What's your YouTube?
Dr. Gabrielle Lyon.
Gabrielle Lyon. Okay.
It talks about really important things, and I always include a paper. For example, it talks about, nutrition and agriculture and the environment, which has a lot of misinformation about it. We talk a lot about some of the, metabolic efficiencies, the Burchard studies, and, we take some studies and we talk about it, put that in a link so you guys can read it. And, this guy is a world-class scientist. And in the age of noise and social media, it's very rare to get direct access to someone who actually discovered some of these things. And, it's
guys, definitely
cool.
Go check that out, because we didn't even get to dive into the agriculture side of everything, which
we'll do it. We'll do it. We'll do it at number 2. We'll do number 2.
Awesome. Well, where can people find you, find more information about what it is that you're doing, and just the wealth of information you're putting out there?
So I am very active on my Instagram, and I write all my own content, and that's Dr. Gabrielle Lyon, Lyon. I have a concierge medical practice, and I only take care of the highly motivated. So if you are a maverick, innovator, CEO, if you are someone who is really looking for substantial change and moving the needle, then you can apply to be part of my concierge practice. And you can see there's a patient application on my website, Dr. Gabrielle Lyon. YouTube is a great place to find me. This is really high value information, and that's under Dr. Gabrielle Lyon. My newsletter, of course, and I have 2 free protocols. One that is not on my website, but I do have a second protocol on my website that it took a lot of time and energy to make. You guys can just get that for free.
All right, go check it out. The Highly Motivated. Thank you so much for coming on today, Dr. Gabrielle Lyon. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for having me.
I hope to have you on again soon so we can continue this wealth of information that you shared today.
Great. Thanks so much.